My name is Gregory Beyer. I'm the percussionist in the Grossman Ensemble, and I'm really excited to be here today on Miyagi Records talking about a piece that I've written for the ensemble, which will be premiered next Friday, March 1st, over at the Logan Center for the Arts. My piece is entitled Amending 13, A Sign of Abundance, and there are several musicians and composers that have inspired the work that I've written. One of the composers that has a really deeply embedded inspiration for my compositional output is the music of Steve Reich. He's inspiring to me as a percussionist. He was a drummer himself and wrote many pivotal works for percussion. I happen to be holding an album, one of his early pieces here called For Organs, and it was written in 1970. A few years later, in 1978, Steve Reich wrote arguably his master opus called Music for 18 Musicians. In fact, in a very unoriginal move, the working title for my piece was Music for 13 Musicians, so kind of a little tongue-in-cheek reference to the music of Steve Reich and his piece Music for 18 Musicians. When I was thinking about how I might write a piece for the Grossman Ensemble, the number 13 just kept coming back. I started thinking about all of the possible permutations of that number and how it might impact elements of rhythm, elements of harmony, a specific harmonic cycle of 13 chords. And slowly but surely the piece ended up evolving around this number 13. And in Steve Reich and Music for 18 Musicians like fashion, I decided to write a harmonic progression that had 13 chords. And those 13 chords were not just any chords, but they were literally 13th chords of various flavors. And then the piece took on a kind of a life of its own, where the formal structure became, I was shooting for and ultimately achieved, a 13-minute piece. And so the embrace of that number, an abstract number of 13, ended up informing a lot of the material of the music. And I attribute a lot of the way that it came together formally and structurally due to the influence of the music of Steve Reich. Well, I'm holding in my hands here 3 albums by the really famous jazz guitarist and composer Pat Metheny. I've got one of his first albums with the Pat Metheny Group, one of his arguably most classic albums, Letter from Home, and then another album in a jazz combo kind of arrangement called 8081. Beautiful album. One of the most powerful influences of the music of Steve Reich and Pat Metheny combined is as a piece that Steve wrote for Pat Metheny called Electric Counterpoint. When I was a graduate school student at the Manhattan School of Music, I really fell in love with the sound of electric counterpoint. In fact, my entry into the music of Steve Reich actually had more to do with my love for the music of Pat Metheny, and it was through the music of Pat Metheny that I found Steve Reich. Although I'm a percussionist, it was really a guitarist that kind of brought me there. And the music of Pat Metheny over the course of a long, many decades has always played it's been effectively a soundtrack in my life. And there's one album in particular of his called The Way Up. It's a really powerful, almost symphonic length work. And in interviews with Metheny and Lyle Mays, his unfortunately deceased compositional partner, they referred to The Way Up not as a body of tunes on an album, but really a composition. They weren't really writing songs anymore or tunesmithing. They were composing something. And that album, it goes on just a magical carpet ride of over an hour of music. And at the beginning of the second section, the second big movement of The Way Up, there's a moment when the piano is playing these really gorgeous arpeggiations that are in mixed meter, over which comes this really just haunting melody in double bass. And the idea of arpeggiating over a mixed meter was something that I took with me to create one of the main fragments of music that shows up in my piece, Amending 13. I wasn't expecting to find this, but right next to the collection of Pat Metheny albums is another album by another guitarist, John McLaughlin, a really famous jazz and sort of crossover fusion guitarist. And I don't know this album, but it's called Belo Horizonte, which is meaningful to me because Belo Horizonte is the capital of the state of Minas Gerais in the center of Brazil. And when I was a Fulbright scholar in 2015 and 2016, I lived in Belo Horizonte and I taught at the Federal University there in the School of Music. And I trained the art of capoeira, a body game that has really deep African roots. And the reason I did that was because for decades now I've been playing the Afro-Brazilian berimbau, which is an African musical bow that made its way to Brazil and became part of the body game of capoeira. In my piece Amending 13, which we'll hear next Friday night, when the segment of music of 13/8 arrives, I am one of the first people to grab a musical instrument from a series of clapping and stepping and dancing, and I grab my berimbau and start to intone 13/8 meter, and soon enough all of my string player colleagues, they'll be joining me playing that pattern, and the five of us are creating this kind of churning pattern that has everything to do with my experiences in capoeira and my experiences playing the berimbau and everything that means, the travels that I've gone on through Brazil and through Africa thanks to the musical bow. And a lot of those memories are associated with the city of Belo Horizonte, which I think is just, it feels really auspicious to have found this album. I can't wait to hear it. So the specific points of cultural synthesis that I'm going for in Amending 13 have a lot to do with African musics as they're manifest throughout the Americas. So I was really happy to find both of these records. This one says it was recorded live in Africa, rhythmic hypnotic music of Africa performed by Agwagi African musicians. This one, Africa ceremonial and folk music recorded in Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, so obviously Eastern Africa. I'm really inspired and kind of deeply reminded of how indebted I feel as a percussionist in the 21st century living in the United States in the face of such an incredible musical heritage that we have received from Africa and from African people throughout the Americas. And so in my own studies and in my own artistry as a percussionist, the Afro-Brazilian berimbau that I mentioned from Brazil, the Afro-Cuban bata drumming, which is really a Nigerian drum on the island of Cuba, the mbira from the Shona people of Zimbabwe, and even the African-American drum set. All of these are instruments that I'll be playing in my piece, and collectively this idea of connecting multiple strands of African musical DNA in the Americas just feels like a logical next step forward for me as a way of not so much saying Black Lives Matter, but playing Black Lives Matter, and really demonstrating my gratitude for and my respect for the richness that is African musical traditions as they exist and in their multiple forms in the Americas. And for me as a creative musician and as a composer, looking for ways to take what I have studied and learned in a very deep and kind of visceral way, and then share that with the world through a very specific lens and with my colleagues and with our community.